All right, in this video, we're going to expand this idea of production possibilities to a concept of trade. And the biggest thing that we want to look at is what should individuals, countries, these different entities, what should they do? What should they produce? How much of each should they produce? And can they trade and be better off? And so we're going to end up defining and utilizing these terms absolute and comparative advantage. Absolute and comparative advantage when it comes to trade. So we're going to use some of the concepts that we already know to figure this out. If Bob's on an island and Tom's on an island and they could trade, who should produce what? And why should they produce that? And, should they produce everything themselves and not trade at all? Would they be better off doing that? So let's use this example that we have been using of food and shelter. And let's assume that they could trade food and they could trade shelter. So we'll use Bob as our example. And for Bob, we're going to make a production possibilities frontier for him. And for Tom, we'll make a production possibilities frontier for him. And we'll kind of compare these two things of food and shelter and food and shelter. Okay, so let's say Bob, smaller island, he's not as good at producing stuff, but let's say for food, he can produce 10 units of output for food, and he could produce 10 units of output for shelter. And this is going to be his production possibilities frontier, just like that, 10 and 10. For Tom, on the other hand, he's got a bit of a bigger island. He's got more resources, let's say. And for food, let's say he can produce 15 units of food. And he could produce, I should say, 20 units of shelter. And so we look at his production possibilities, and it looks something like that. So who should produce what? Should Tom produce everything himself and keep all of his food and his shelter on his own island? Would he be better off trading to Bob? Who should produce which of these two goods? And what would be okay for them to trade for? So we're going to examine these ideas. And one of the ways to do that is to try and show this in a little bit more of a simple way to kind of complete our analysis. So let's say that we have, let's say Bob, and this is Tom. And we're going to put this stuff into a little bit of a chart to show the different amounts that they could produce. So let's call this food and this shelter. And let's say we look at Bob's, right? So Bob, if he just produces food, he could produce 10. If he just produced shelter, he could produce 10. So we want to look at opportunity cost. So what's the opportunity cost of producing one good? How much do I have to give up of the other good? It's what I have to give up. So Tom, on the other hand, he can produce 15 units of food and 20 units of shelter. Okay? So looking at this very easily, we can see that who has an absolute advantage. And that the absolute advantage, the good definition is who can produce more. Who can produce more? Well, for when it comes to producing food, we can see that Tom can produce 15, Bob only can produce 10. So when it comes to food, the absolute advantage goes to Tom. When it comes to shelter, absolute advantage, Tom again. So most people look at absolute advantage and they say, well, Tom should produce food and shelter and he shouldn't trade with Bob because Tom can produce more of food and shelter, and so that's where we leave it. But the problem is we want to know what's the opportunity cost. We want to look at comparative advantage. So in order to look at comparative advantage, you look at who can produce with the least opportunity cost. All right, who can produce with the least opportunity cost? So how do we calculate opportunity cost here? Well, looking at Bob, when Bob makes one food, how much shelter does he have to give up? So for every one food that he makes, how much do we have to minus over here for shelter? Well, that's pretty easy to see, right? So for every 10 that he makes, he has to give up 10, right? Because you can either produce 10 food and 0 shelter, or you can produce 10 shelter and 0 food. So 1 shelter is his opportunity cost. So this number right here is opportunity cost for every 1. Okay, and one of the ways to remember this is just kind of a hint way to remember this, is that this is looking at, this is an output question, right? This is an output. The output is 10 units of the good is how much we're producing. So when I'm calculating, the other number goes over. So OOO is our little acronym right here. So 10 over 10, which is 1, but it'll be more clear when we look at this bottom example. So for 1 shelter, how much food does he have to give up? 1 food. So this 1 food is the opportunity cost. So now we know Bob's opportunity cost when he produces each one of the 2 goods. Well, what about Tom? So when Tom is producing food, right? When Tom is producing food, we know that 1 food, how much shelter does he have to give up? How much shelter does he have to give up when he produces that 1 food? So other number goes over, 20 over 15. For every 15 that he makes, we know that he has to give up 20 shelter. That's going to be 4 thirds, right? So 20 over 15 is 4 thirds, or 1.33, 1 1/3, which means the opportunity cost for every 1 unit of food is 4 thirds of a shelter. So in order to gain 1 thing of food, you give up 4 thirds of 1 shelter. And so that is the opportunity cost in terms of food to shelter. So on this other side, what we can do is we can figure out what the opportunity cost in terms of food is for making 1 shelter. So we can do the same sort of thing that we did above, which is 1 shelter equals how many units of food. And so in order to do this, we use our same sort of OOO, output other goes over. We just kind of use this to calculate. So for every 1 shelter that I make, how many food could I have made? And so this is 15 over 20, which equals 3/4. Or it's always the inverse of the other one. So this is 4 thirds. The one on this side, one on the left-hand side is 4 thirds. The one on the right-hand side is 3/4. 3/4 of food. So for every 1 shelter I make, I could have made 3/4 of a food. Now, if you look at these, there's some ways to kind of like try and remember this a little bit. Like if I'm going to get a number that's bigger or less than 1. And so if I'm looking at this one, I can make more of these. There's 20 of these. So for every 1 of those I made, I had to have given up less than 1 of the other one because I could only make 15 of these total. So for every 1 of these that I made, I'm a little bit slower at making the other 1, you could say, something like that. But anyways, now we have opportunity costs figured out. So what we can do is we can compare all of these different opportunity costs. So we'll highlight those for Bob and Tom in green and red. And then you can start to decide, well, who is better at doing what? So we already determined that Tom has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods, right? So Tom can produce 15, Tom can produce 20. So he's technically, he can produce more of both goods, but he can't produce each good at a lower opportunity cost than the other person. Because the better he is at one of the two means the higher the opportunity cost is for him to not do that one, right? The higher the opportunity cost there is for him to not do that one. So look at it like this. If Bob makes a food, he has to give up 1 shelter. But if Tom makes that exact same food, he has to give up 4 thirds of a shelter, right? So who's giving up more shelters in order to make a food. So just look at it like this. You could make this thing of food, or you could construct a shelter. And so let's give Bob a chance to do it. Bob makes some food. So he made one thing of food. What did he have to give up, or what couldn't he do as a result of that one thing of food? Make one shelter, right? But Tom, on the other hand, right, in order to make that one food, he had to give up 4/3 of a shelter. So we don't have 4/3 of a shelter as a result of him having to make that food. So you know what? We want to go with whoever it's cheapest, right? Whoever can produce at the lowest opportunity cost. So looking in these sorts of terms, we can see that Bob has a lower opportunity cost to produce food. It only costs him one shelter, whereas Tom would have to give up 1 1/3 shelters in order to make the same food. So the comparative advantage in production of food, the comparative advantage goes to Bob. Right? Well, what about shelter? Is that Bob as well, or is that one Tom? Well, one of the things to always remember is that the opposite person is going to always have the lower opportunity cost. So Tom is definitely going to have the lower opportunity cost in shelter, but we can use the numbers to compare these things. So looking at these, you can see that, again, Bob has to give up one food for that one shelter, like we already talked about. But Tom, on the other hand, only has to give up 3/4 of a food. So that means he can make shelters cheaper than Bob can. Right? Bob has to give up a whole food, and Tom only has to give up 3/4 of a food. So it's cheaper. He can produce shelters at a lower opportunity cost. So this box goes to Tom. So who has the comparative advantage in building shelters? Tom.